One of the most captivating mysteries in English history is the princes in the Tower. The young Edward V, the rightful King of England, and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, who mysteriously disappeared within the walls of the Tower of London. The two boys were being protected, supposedly, by their uncle Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who would then usurp the young King Edward V, declaring the boys illegitimate and taking the throne for himself. Many historians believe that the boys were murdered upon the orders of King Richard III, their uncle, to secure the throne for himself, and there are other theories about their disappearances, and a number of pretenders would emerge in the years after who would try to take the English throne. But in 1674, workmen inside of the Tower of London excavated a wooden box under a staircase inside of the White Tower's stairwell, and inside the box were two small human skeletons. Edward V and Richard the Duke of York were held inside of the Tower of London, as was traditional for monarchs before their coronation. But this was postponed by their uncle, the latter Richard III. A sermon was then preached that claimed that Richard III was the only legitimate heir to the House of York, and with this Richard took the throne, and both of the princes were declared illegitimate, and this was then later confirmed in an Act of Parliament. Dominic Mancini, an Italian priest, visited England at the time, and he wrote about Richard III seizing the throne, and he claimed that the two boys were taken into the inner apartments of the Tower, and then gradually they were seen less and less until they were never seen again. It was written also that Edward V was also visited by a doctor many times, and that he may have been ill. Mancini wrote that Edward was like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. There are also reports that the princes were seen playing inside the grounds of the Tower, but then, following the summer of 1483, there were no further sightings, and their fate today remains a mystery. The most common belief is that the two were murdered as a way of legitimising Richard III on the throne. Some also have suggested that the princes may have been kept alive for some time, or even exiled, but the issue with the princes in the Tower is that there is no concrete evidence as to what certainly happened with the two. There were 4 unidentified bodies which were found, which have been linked to the events that occurred inside the Tower of London relating to the princes. 2 of these were found inside of the Tower of London, and 2 of them were found inside St George's Chapel inside of Windsor Castle. The 2 found at the Tower were buried inside of Westminster Abbey. On the 17th of July 1674, there were workmen inside the White Tower who were performing some remodelling works, and they dug near a staircase to the entrance of the White Tower, and here they found a wooden box containing the remains of 2 small humans, or children. The bones were found buried at a depth of 10 feet under the staircase which led to the chapel of the White Tower, but the remains were not the first set of bones to be found in the Tower of children. Previously, 2 other skeletons were found in an old chamber which had been walled up, and one historian claims that these also could have been the princes in the Tower. The bones found inside of the Tower were linked to the princes, and Thomas More said that they were then moved to a better place following their deaths, and a report stated that inside of the wooden box, or the makeshift coffin, were also pieces of rag and velvet, and this could have been pieces of clothing. The use of velvet would indicate that these were high-status children, as this was a material which was only accessible to the wealthy and the nobility or aristocracy. But 4 years after the bones were discovered, they were then transferred into an urn, and then King Charles II of the time insisted that they be placed inside of Westminster Abbey, and specifically in the wall of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, near to where the founders of the Tudor dynasty were buried, and other queens such as Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots, which was a remarkable thing, as the bones were placed right at the heart of the English monarchy and worship, and their monument was inscribed with the writing, "Here lies interred the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York, whose long desired and much sought after bones, after over 190 years, were found interred deep beneath the rubble of the stairs that led up to the chapel of the White Tower, on the 17th of July, the year of our Lord, 1674. But there was an issue, and there still is. There has never been DNA testing on the bones, if any could be obtained, to prove that these were the princes in the Tower's body, and if still this was ever obtained, then it would not say who killed the boys or what happened to them. The bones were examined in 1933 by Lawrence Tanner, the archivist of Westminster Abbey, and a leading anatomist named Professor William Wright, and also an expert dentist, George Northcroft. The investigations concluded that the skeletons in Westminster Abbey belonged to 2 children, and children around the correct age which the princes would have been when they died. They had been interred rather carelessly, and also found in the urn were animal bones, and some of the bones were also missing, and one skeleton was larger than the other. Part of the jawbone of one of the bodies, and also all of the teeth from the larger skeleton, had been taken also. But the investigation was nowhere near thorough enough. They missed whether the remains were male or female, and they only really looked as if they were any sign of suffocation. But no further scientific examination has been conducted on these remains since. But as mentioned, there were 2 other bodies linked to the princes in the Tower mystery. In 1789, workmen were carrying out repairs in St George's Chapel, and they accidentally broke into the burial vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. They found a small vault next to this, and this vault held the coffins of 2 mysterious children. There was no inscription or examination of these coffins, and the tomb, and it was then resealed. The tomb, it was said, was inscribed with 2 of Edward IV's children, George I, Duke of Bedford, and also Mary of York, who had died before the king. But 2 lead coffins labelled as these children were actually discovered elsewhere in the chapel, and these were then moved back into the vault of Edward IV. But there was no further inspection of the coffins that lay in the adjoining vault. So whose were these children? In the 1990s, further work was being carried out near to Edward IV's tomb, and the floor was excavated, and requests were made to consider an examination of the vaults using modern technology. But royal approval was needed to be given to open a royal tomb. However, Elizabeth II never granted the approval for this. But there are hopes that King Charles I could grant this and support an investigation, as he has differing opinions on this than his mother did. But still today, the princes in the Tower remains a mystery, and it's not known for certain if it will remain this way throughout history. There are hopes of the remains either inside of Westminster, maybe DNA tested, or whether the investigation inside of St George's Chapel will show that these remains belong to the boys. Whatever happened inside the Tower of London in the lead up to the coronation of Edward V is rather shocking, especially as the belief is that they were murdered. Each year new theories emerge relating to this, but over 500 years on, nothing is closer to being solved. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.